Your son can walk, but your fiancé stops him," said the poor girl to the billionaire. He laughs and before continuing, "Please comment on which part of the world you are watching from." The gleaming towers of Manhattan cast long shadows over the homeless encampments below, where 5-year-old Layla huddled beneath a tattered cardboard box. Her tiny fingers clutched a worn photograph of her parents, lost in the chaos of war that had brought her to America's shores. The refugee shelters were overcrowded, and the little girl had learned to survive on the streets with a wisdom far beyond her years. Across the city, in a penthouse that touched the clouds, Walid al-Nasir stood before floor-to-ceiling windows, his empire sprawling beneath him like a conquered kingdom. The Arab billionaire's pharmaceutical company had revolutionized medical treatments, making him one of the most powerful men in the world. Yet for all his wealth and influence, he carried a burden that money couldn't heal. His 10-year-old son, Amir, confined to a wheelchair since a tragic accident 3 years ago. Grace Thompson, his elegant fiancée and soon-to-be wife, had been their beacon of hope during those dark times. A former pediatric nurse with angelic blonde hair and compassionate blue eyes, she had devoted herself to caring for Amir with unwavering dedication. The medical community praised her as a saint, and Walid believed he had found not just a wife, but a mother for his broken son. In the sterile corridors of their Upper East Side mansion, Amir sat motionless in his custom wheelchair, staring out at Central Park with eyes that held secrets too heavy for a child to bear. Grace adjusted his blanket with gentle hands, whispering sweet words that masked a darker truth lurking beneath her nurturing facade. 2 worlds, one of unimaginable wealth, another of desperate poverty, were about to collide in the most unexpected way. And at the center of it all, a refugee child would become the unlikely key to unlocking a conspiracy that would shake the foundations of one of America's most powerful families. The morning sun filtered through the grimy windows of the abandoned subway entrance, where Layla had spent another sleepless night. Her stomach growled with a familiar ache as she watched well-dressed people hurry past, their designer shoes clicking against the pavement in rhythmic indifference. At 5 years old, she had already learned that survival meant being invisible, a shadow moving through a world that had forgotten children like her existed. Her small hands traced the edges of her mother's photograph, the only connection to a life before the bombs, before the journey across an ocean to a land that promised safety but delivered only more struggle. The social workers had tried to help, but the system was overwhelmed, and Layla had slipped through cracks wider than the Grand Canyon. 3 blocks away, in the marble-floored lobby of Al-Nasir Pharmaceuticals, Walid stood before a gathering of the world's most influential medical researchers. His company had just announced a breakthrough in spinal cord regeneration therapy, a treatment that could potentially help millions of paralyzed patients worldwide. The irony wasn't lost on him. He could fund research to heal the world, yet his own son remained confined to a wheelchair. "The trials have shown remarkable results," Dr. Martinez explained, pointing to brain scans on the massive display screen. "We're seeing neural pathway reconstruction that was previously thought impossible. Within 2 years, we could begin human trials." Walid nodded, his mind drifting to Amir. His son had been such a vibrant boy before the accident, running through the mansion's halls, climbing trees in the garden, full of laughter and mischief. Now, the child sat quietly in his room most days, his spirit as broken as his supposed mobility. Grace had been instrumental in maintaining some semblance of normalcy. She organized Amir's homeschooling, managed his physical therapy sessions, and ensured he received the best medical care money could provide. Her dedication was unwavering, often spending 18 hours a day focused solely on the boy's needs. "Mr. Al-Nasir," Grace's voice came through his phone during a brief break in the meeting. "Amir is having one of his difficult days. The physical therapist says his muscle atrophy is progressing faster than expected. Perhaps we should consider the experimental treatment Dr. Chen mentioned in Switzerland." Walid closed his eyes, feeling the weight of helplessness that had become his constant companion. Schedule the consultation, whatever it costs. Meanwhile, 6 floors above, in the penthouse suite of the same building, Amir sat in his wheelchair by the window, watching the tiny figures moving on the street below. His stepmother had left him alone for 30 minutes, a rare occurrence that he treasured. Grace's constant presence, while caring, often felt suffocating. When he was certain she wouldn't return immediately, Amir slowly moved his legs. The sensation sent electricity through his body, not pain, but the forbidden joy of movement. He had been able to move his legs for over a year now, the feeling gradually returning in secret moments when Grace wasn't monitoring his every breath. But each time he had tried to tell his father, Grace would intervene with medical explanations about phantom sensations and false hope. She had convinced everyone, including the doctors, that Amir's condition was permanent and that any claims of improvement were merely psychological coping mechanisms. 3 stories below, Layla pressed her face against the building's glass doors, watching the elegant people in expensive suits discuss matters she couldn't understand. A security guard approached, ready to shoo her away like the pest society considered her to be. "Please," she whispered in broken English, her Arabic accent thick despite her efforts to sound American. "Just warm, very cold outside." The guard's expression softened slightly. He had children of his own. "5 minutes, kid. Then you gotta go." As Layla stood in the lobby, her keen eyes caught something unusual. Through the glass elevator, she could see into the penthouse floor. A boy in a wheelchair was moving, not rolling but actually standing and walking to reach something on a high shelf. Her young mind struggled to process what she was seeing. In her war-torn homeland, she had witnessed many deceptions, many lies told for survival. But this felt different. This felt like a secret that could change everything. The elevator doors closed, and the boy quickly returned to his wheelchair, just as an elegant blonde woman entered the room. Days passed before Layla worked up the courage to return to the gleaming building that housed Al Nasir Pharmaceuticals. She had been thinking about the boy in the wheelchair who could walk, her young mind trying to understand why someone would pretend to be unable to move. In her homeland, she had seen children fake injuries to gain sympathy and food, but this seemed different, more complex and somehow sadder. The same security guard recognized her when she approached the building's entrance. Tom Rodriguez had been working security for 15 years, and something about the little refugee girl tugged at his heartstrings. His own daughter was close to Layla's age, and he couldn't imagine her alone on the streets. "Back again," he asked, not unkindly. "Look, kid, I can't let you stay here. Mr. Al Nasser runs a tight ship, and homeless folks hanging around makes the clients nervous." Layla's eyes filled with tears, but she stood her ground. "The boy," she said in her halting English, "the boy in the chair. He walks when the lady leaves." Tom frowned. "What boy? What are you talking about?" Before Layla could respond, the main elevator doors opened, and Walid Al Nasser himself stepped out, flanked by 3 men in expensive suits. He was discussing quarterly projections and expansion plans, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. Layla's refugee instincts told her this was the man who mattered, the one with power. In her young life, she had learned to identify those who could change circumstances. Her parents had taught her to speak truth to power, even when it seemed impossible. "Sir," she called out, her small voice echoing in the marble lobby. "Your son can walk." The entire group stopped. Conversations halted. The only sound was the soft whirring of the building's ventilation system. Walid turned, his dark eyes focusing on the tiny girl who had dared interrupt a billion-dollar discussion. "Excuse me?" His voice was controlled but carried an edge of irritation. Layla stepped forward, despite Tom's attempts to gently pull her back. "Your son, in the wheelchair. He walks when the pretty lady goes away." "I saw him." He stands up and walks to the shelf. The businessmen exchanged uncomfortable glances. One of them whispered something about street children and their fantasies. Another suggested calling social services, but Walid raised his hand for silence, his attention fully fixed on Layla. "What pretty lady?" he asked, crouching down to meet her at eye level. "The one with yellow hair. She watches him always. But when she leaves for short time, he gets up. He walks. He can move his legs, but she stops him from telling you." The words hung in the air like a bomb waiting to explode. Walid's world tilted on its axis. Grace's flowing blonde hair flashed through his mind, along with her constant insistence on managing every aspect of Amir's care, her explanations for why certain doctors couldn't examine him, her control over his son's medical records. "You're certain about what you saw?" Walid's voice had dropped to almost a whisper. Layla nodded emphatically. "In my country, I see many people pretend for safety, but this boy, he's sad, very, very sad, like bird in cage who remembers how to fly. The metaphor hit Walid like a physical blow. Tom Rodriguez found himself fighting back tears, moved by the little girl's earnest conviction and the pain in her voice when she spoke of cages and forgotten flight. Walid stood slowly, his mind racing through 3 years of medical reports, therapy sessions, and Grace's unwavering dedication. He thought about the massive inheritance Amir would receive, the trust funds, the company shares that would transfer to Grace as his legal guardian if something were to happen to Walid himself. "What's your name, little one?" he asked. "Layla. I am Layla. Layla, I want you to come with me. We're going to go see my son together." As they walked toward the elevator, Walid's phone buzzed with a text from Grace. "Amir is having severe muscle spasms today. Had to increase his pain medication. Please don't disturb him when you get home." The timing felt like more than coincidence. The elevator ride to the penthouse felt like an eternity. Walid watched Layla's reflection in the polished steel doors, her small frame dwarfed by the opulent space. Tom Rodriguez had insisted on accompanying them, his protective instincts toward the refugee child overriding corporate protocol. As they ascended, Walid's mind raced through fragments of memory. Grace's insistence on handling all of Amir's medical appointments alone, her explanations for why certain specialists were unsuitable, and her recent push to formalize adoption papers that would give her legal guardianship. "Mr. Al-Nasir," Tom said quietly, "I've been working security here for 15 years. I've never seen that little girl lie about anything. She asks for food, for warmth, but she's never made up stories." The elevator chimed softly as they reached the penthouse floor. Through the glass walls, they could see into the main living area where Amir sat in his wheelchair, staring blankly at a tablet screen. Grace was nowhere to be seen, unusual for this time of day when she typically supervised his afternoon educational sessions. Walid used his keycard to access the private residence. The moment they stepped inside, Amir looked up, his eyes widening with surprise at seeing strangers in their home, but it was the flash of hope that crossed his face upon seeing his father that made Walid's heart constrict with sudden understanding. "Papa." Amir's voice was small, uncertain. "Grace said you wouldn't be home until tonight. Change of plans, son." Walid approached slowly, studying his boy with new eyes. "Where is Grace?" "She went to the pharmacy to get my new medicine. She said—" Amir hesitated, glancing toward the hallway that led to the bedrooms. "She said I might need to go to the hospital again if the pain doesn't stop." Layla stepped forward, her young face serious with purpose. "You don't have pain," she said matter-of-factly. "You have sadness, different thing." Amir's eyes met hers, and in that moment, 2 children who had experienced unthinkable losses recognized each other. One trapped by deception, the other by circumstances beyond her control, both prisoners in different ways. "What sadness?" Walid asked, kneeling beside his son's wheelchair. The boy looked toward the hallway again, as if Grace might materialize at any moment. "Papa, he started, then stopped. Years of conditioning had taught him that certain truths were dangerous. Layla walked to the large window overlooking Central Park. "In my country, there was a man who pretended he could not walk. Soldiers. They give food to people who cannot walk. But at night, when soldiers sleep, he would dance in his tent. Happy dance, because he remember who he really is." The metaphor was simple, but its impact was profound. Amir's eyes filled with tears. "I remember who I am," he whispered. "But Grace says if I tell you, bad things will happen. She says the doctors will hurt me, do surgeries that will make it worse. She says you might get sick from the stress and die, like Mama did." Walid felt his world crumbling. Sarah, his first wife, had died from a sudden heart attack shortly after Amir's accident. Grace had been their nurse then, helping them through the darkest period of their lives. She had seemed like an angel, devoted to helping a grieving widower and his traumatized son. "Son," Walid said carefully, "when did you start feeling better? When did the numbness go away?" Amir glanced at Tom Rodriguez, who had positioned himself by the door as a lookout. The security guard nodded encouragingly. "About a year ago," Amir admitted. "The tingling came back first. Then I could move my toes. Grace said it was just nerves healing wrong, that it didn't mean anything real." "But Papa, I can stand, I can walk. I practiced at night when she sleeps." The confession hung in the air like a revelation. 3 years of believing his son was permanently disabled. 3 years of Grace's dedicated care that now seemed more like imprisonment. "Show me," Walid said simply. Amir looked terrified. "Grace says, if anyone sees, they'll take me away from you. They'll put me in a hospital where I'll never come home." Layla approached the wheelchair. Despite their language barrier and vastly different circumstances, she understood the fear in his eyes. "In my country, we have saying, truth is like water. It finds way to surface always." With trembling hands, Amir gripped the armrests of his wheelchair. Slowly, he pushed himself up. His legs, which medical reports claimed were completely without function, supported his weight. He stood for several seconds, tears streaming down his face. "I've been walking in my room at night," he sobbed. "Sometimes I dance like Mama taught me, just to remember how it feels to be normal." Walid's vision blurred as he watched his son take several steps across the room. The boy's gait was slightly unsteady from months of forced inactivity, but he was clearly mobile. The implications crashed over Walid like a tidal wave. 3 years of unnecessary medical treatments, psychological damage from believing he was disabled, and worst of all, the isolation from normal childhood experiences. Tom Rodriguez wiped his eyes, thinking of his own daughter playing soccer in their backyard just yesterday. "Son, why didn't you tell me before?" Walid asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "I tried. Papa, remember last year when you came home early from your business trip? I wanted to show you, but Grace gave me that medicine that makes me sleepy. When I woke up, she said I had been hallucinating from fever. She showed me the thermometer. It said I was really sick." The pieces fell into place with sickening clarity. Grace had been drugging Amir to maintain the illusion, using her medical knowledge to create false symptoms and manipulate test results. The inheritance structure that Walid had established after Sarah's death would transfer a significant portion of his wealth to whoever had legal guardianship of Amir if anything happened to Walid himself. Suddenly, the sound of high heels clicking on marble echoed from the private elevator. Grace's voice carried down the hallway as she spoke on her phone. "Yes, I understand the urgency. We'll need to move faster than planned. The adoption papers should be finalized within the week." Panic flashed across Amir's face. He quickly sat back in his wheelchair, his body tensing with practiced deception. Layla stepped protectively beside him, her small hand resting on his shoulder. "Whatever happens," Walid whispered urgently, "from this moment on, you tell only the truth. No more pretending, no more fear." Grace appeared in the doorway, her blonde hair perfectly styled, her smile warm and welcoming until she noticed the strangers in their home. Her expression shifted subtly, the caring nurse facade slipping just enough to reveal something calculating underneath. "Walid, darling, you're home early," she said, moving toward them with measured steps. "And we have guests?" "Grace, I'd like you to meet Layla," Walid said, his voice carefully neutral. "She had something very interesting to tell me about Amir." Grace's eyes fixed on the little refugee girl, and for just a moment, her mask dropped completely. In that instant, Layla saw something that reminded her of the worst people from her war-torn homeland, those who used others' pain for their own gain. "How lovely," Grace said, her voice honey-sweet, but her eyes cold as winter. What could a street child possibly know about medical conditions? The dismissive tone was a mistake. It revealed Grace's true feelings about those she considered beneath her, and it awakened something fierce in Walid's protective instincts. "She knows," Amir said suddenly, his young voice carrying new strength, "that I can walk." The silence that followed was deafening. Grace's face went through a series of micro-expressions: surprise, fear, anger, and finally, a desperate attempt to regain control. "Oh, sweetie," she said, moving toward Amir with false concern, "you know what the doctors said about these episodes. The trauma sometimes makes your brain think—" "Show her, son," Walid interrupted quietly. And in that moment, everything changed. Amir stood up from his wheelchair, looked Grace directly in the eyes, and took 3 clear, deliberate steps toward his father. Grace's carefully constructed world began to crumble around her. The color drained from Grace's face, as she watched Amir walk across the room. For 3 years, she had meticulously maintained the illusion of his paralysis, carefully monitoring his every moment, controlling his medical care, and manipulating everyone around them. Now, in front of witnesses, her elaborate deception was unraveling. "This is impossible," she stammered, her voice losing its usual confident tone. "Amir, sit down immediately. You could hurt yourself." She moved toward him, but Walid blocked her path. "Don't touch my son," Walid said, his voice carrying a quiet authority that made Grace step back. "In fact, I think it's time we had a very honest conversation about Amir's medical history." Tom Rodriguez, still positioned by the door, quietly activated the recording function on his security device. Years of working in corporate environments had taught him to document everything when situations turned potentially legal. Layla watched the blonde woman's face change, recognizing the expression of someone whose lies were being exposed. In her short life, she had seen this look on the faces of smugglers who had been caught cheating refugees, on officials who had been discovered taking bribes meant for humanitarian aid. "Grace," Amir said, his voice shaking but determined. "Why did you tell Papa I couldn't walk? Why did you give me medicine that made me sleep when I tried to show him?" Grace's composure cracked further. "Amir, honey, you don't understand. The medical complexities of your condition. I understand that you've been lying," Walid interrupted, his anger barely contained. "I understand that my son has been trapped in a wheelchair for 3 years, while you've been planning to adopt him and gain control of his inheritance." The accusation hung in the air like a sword. Grace's eyes darted between the exits, calculating her options. She had always been intelligent, always had contingency plans, but she had never anticipated a 5-year-old refugee girl destroying years of careful manipulation. "That's ridiculous," Grace said, attempting to regain her composure. "I love Amir as if he were my own son. Everything I've done has been for his benefit." Layla stepped forward, her young voice cutting through the tension. "In my country, I know woman like you. She take care of old man, very sick. She give him medicine, but not to make him better, to keep him sick, so she get his house when he die." The parallel was devastatingly accurate. Grace's face flushed with anger. "How dare you?" she snapped at Layla. "You're just a street child with no education, no understanding of medical science. You have no right to be in this home, making wild accusations." But her outburst only confirmed what everyone in the room now suspected. The caring, selfless nurse had revealed her true nature, someone who saw vulnerable people as opportunities rather than human beings deserving of help. Walid pulled out his phone. "I'm calling Dr. Harrison at Mount Sinai. He's been Amir's neurologist since the accident. I think it's time for an independent evaluation." "No." Grace's response was too quick, too panicked. "I mean, we shouldn't overwhelm Amir with unnecessary tests. His condition is fragile and—" "His condition," Walid said slowly, "appears to be remarkably stable. In fact, he seems healthier than he's been in years." Amir had been listening to the adult conversation with growing understanding. At 10 years old, he was intelligent enough to grasp that Grace had been controlling his life through deception. The realization was both liberating and terrifying. "Papa," he said quietly, "there's something else. Grace has been teaching me to sign papers. She said it was for school, but the words were about money and inheritance." Walid's blood ran cold. What kind of papers? "Forms that said if something happened to you, Grace would take care of everything. She said it was just practice, like homework." The full scope of Grace's plan became clear. She hadn't just been maintaining the illusion of Amir's disability for the inheritance. She had been preparing legal documents that would ensure her control over the family fortune regardless of circumstances. Grace realized her position was becoming untenable. "You're all being ridiculous," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. "Amir, tell your father about your leg pain this morning. Tell him about the muscle spasms." But Amir shook his head. "I didn't have pain." "Grace, I never have pain in my legs. You told me to say that when Papa asked questions." The admission was devastating. Years of medical records documenting symptoms that had never existed. Treatments for conditions that were purely fictional, all orchestrated by someone they had trusted with their most precious relationships. Tom Rodriguez spoke for the first time since entering the apartment. "Ma'am, I think you should know that this conversation has been recorded as part of our security protocols. Mr. Al-Nasir, Would you like me to contact the authorities? Grace's mask finally fell completely away. The caring, devoted stepmother disappeared, replaced by someone calculating and desperate. You have no idea what you're doing, she said to Walid, her voice now cold and threatening. Do you think Amir's recovery will be easy? Do you think he can just return to normal life after 3 years? The psychological damage alone will require years of therapy. And what about you? How will it look when the world discovers that the great Walid al-Nasser couldn't even recognize that his own son was healthy? Your pharmaceutical company claims to be developing treatments for spinal cord injuries, yet you couldn't see that your son never needed treatment at all. The manipulation was subtle but cruel, attempting to make Walid doubt himself and fear public humiliation. But Layla, despite her young age, recognized the tactic. Bad people always try to make good people feel guilty, she said simply. My mama told me this before the bombs came. She said some people hurt others, then make them think it's their fault for being hurt. Her innocent wisdom cut through Grace's psychological manipulation like a knife through silk. Walid looked at his son, really looked at him, and saw not a broken child, but a boy who had been systematically denied his own agency and truth. Amir, he said gently, I want you to walk to the window. Take your time, but I want to see how you really are. Amir smiled, the first genuine, unrestricted smile Walid had seen from his son in 3 years. He walked across the room with growing confidence, his movements becoming more natural with each step. At the window, he turned and ran back to his father, throwing his arms around him in an embrace that spoke of years of suppressed joy and freedom. Grace watched her carefully constructed plans dissolve. 3 years of meticulous work, of playing the role of devoted caregiver, of manipulating medical records and drugging a child, all undone by a homeless refugee girl who had simply told the truth. The police will want to examine those medical records, Walid said quietly. They'll want to understand how a paralyzed child was receiving treatments he never needed. They'll want to know about the medications you've been administering, the forged test results, the insurance fraud. For the first time, Grace looked truly afraid. The legal implications of her actions were enormous. Medical fraud, child abuse, conspiracy to commit inheritance fraud, and possibly attempted murder through unnecessary medical interventions. Layla tugged on Walid's sleeve. Sir, in my country, when bad people get caught, they sometimes try to hurt the witnesses. You should be careful. Her warning proved prescient. Grace's expression shifted to something genuinely dangerous. You think this is over, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. You think you can just expose me and everything goes back to normal. I know things about your business, Walid. I know about the clinical trials that were rushed, about the safety data that was suppressed. Destroy me and I'll destroy everything you've built. The threat revealed the true depths of Grace's malevolence. She had positioned herself not just to steal from a grieving family, but to have leverage over Walid's entire empire. But she had made one crucial miscalculation. She had underestimated the power of truth spoken by a child who had already lost everything and had nothing left to fear. Grace's threats hung in the air like poison, but they only strengthened Walid's resolve. He had built his pharmaceutical empire on the principle of helping others heal, and now he understood that someone he trusted had been using his own son as a weapon against everything he believed in. Tom, Walid said calmly, please escort Grace to the security office downstairs. Make sure she doesn't leave the building until the authorities arrive. You can't do this, Grace protested, her composure completely shattered. I have legal rights as Amir's stepmother. I have medical power of attorney. Power of attorney obtained through fraud is worthless, Walid replied, and you were never legally his stepmother. We never completed the marriage ceremony. Remember, you insisted we wait until after the adoption papers were finalized. The reminder hit Grace like a physical blow. In her greed, she had delayed their wedding to ensure the adoption would give her stronger legal standing. Now that delay had eliminated her strongest legal protection. Layla watched the confrontation with the solemn understanding of someone who had witnessed too much adult cruelty. But she also recognized something that the adults hadn't yet grasped. Grace was dangerous precisely because she was cornered. Mr. Walid, Layla said urgently, she has medicine in her bag. I see her put something in Amir's juice this morning when she think no one look. Grace's face went white. She clutched her designer purse closer to her body, confirming Layla's observation. What medicine? Walid demanded. Just his regular supplements, Grace said quickly, but her voice lacked conviction. Tom Rodriguez stepped forward. Ma'am, I'm going to need you to hand over that bag. You have no right. Actually, we do, Walid interrupted. This is a private residence, and you're now trespassing. Either cooperate with security, or we'll let the police search your belongings when they arrive. With shaking hands, Grace surrendered her purse. Tom carefully examined its contents, finding several unmarked vials and pre-filled syringes, along with prescription bottles bearing other people's names. Jesus, Tom muttered. This looks like enough sedatives to knock out a horse. Amir stared at the vials in horror. That's what you've been giving me. When I tried to show Papa I could walk, you said it was vitamins to help my bones. The full scope of Grace's abuse became clear. She hadn't just been maintaining the illusion of Amir's paralysis. She had been chemically restraining him, using powerful sedatives to keep him compliant and confused whenever he attempted to reveal the truth. Walid felt sick as he realized how many times over the past year Amir had probably tried to communicate his recovery, only to be drugged into submission. The psychological damage from that kind of systematic gaslighting would take years to heal. Layla approached Amir, her small hand finding his. Despite their different backgrounds, they shared the bond of children who had survived adult betrayal. It's not your fault, she said simply. Bad people very good at making children think they crazy. But you not crazy. You just trapped. Her words carried the weight of someone who understood imprisonment intimately. In refugee camps, she had seen adults manipulate children through false kindness that masked exploitation. Grace made one last desperate attempt to regain control. Amir, sweetheart, tell your father about your nightmares. Tell him about the panic attacks you have when you try to walk. You know how scared you get. Stop, Amir said, his young voice carrying newfound strength. Those weren't nightmares. Those were memories of you giving me shots when I tried to tell the truth, and I wasn't scared of walking. I was scared of you. The distinction was crucial. Grace had been using Amir's natural anxiety about disappointing her as evidence of medical trauma, when in reality, she was the source of his fear. Dr. Harrison arrived within an hour, having rushed from Mount Sinai Hospital after Walid's urgent call. A respected neurologist with 30 years of experience, he had been frustrated for months by the inconsistencies in Amir's case, test results that didn't match symptoms, medications that seemed unnecessary, and Grace's insistence on controlling all aspects of the boy's care. Amir, Dr. Harrison said gently, I'd like to examine you without any interference from anyone else. Is that okay with you? For the first time in 3 years, Amir nodded eagerly. The examination took place in his bedroom, with only Dr. Harrison present. When they emerged 40 minutes later, the doctor's expression was grim. Walid, I need to speak with you privately, Dr. Harrison said. Yes, but first, let me say this clearly. There is absolutely nothing wrong with this boy's spinal cord, nervous system, or muscular structure. He shows no signs of current or previous paralysis. Grace, still flanked by Tom Rodriguez, went completely pale. Furthermore, Dr. Harrison continued, the blood work we did 6 months ago showed traces of benzodiazepines and muscle relaxants that were never prescribed by my office. At the time, Grace explained they were from another specialist, but I should have investigated further. The medical evidence was damning. Grace had been systematically drugging a healthy child to maintain a profitable lie. Detective Maria Santos arrived with 2 uniformed officers, having been briefed by dispatch about a suspected case of medical fraud and child abuse. A veteran investigator with a particular expertise in cases involving vulnerable victims, she quickly grasped the complexity of the situation. Mr. Al-Nasir, I understand we have some serious allegations here, Detective Santos said, but I also understand there's a young witness who helped uncover this situation. Layla stepped forward, no longer intimidated by authority figures. Her experiences had taught her to distinguish between those who protected and those who exploited. I see the boy walking when the woman go away, Layla explained in her careful English. In my country, I learned to watch people very careful. This woman, she pretend to be good, but her eyes, they hungry, like wolf who dress like sheep. Detective Santos nodded, recognizing the wisdom that often came from children who had survived trauma. Layla, you did exactly the right thing by speaking up. Sometimes adults forget that children see things very clearly. The detective turned to Grace, who was now visibly shaking. "Ma'am, you're under arrest for suspected child abuse, medical fraud, and conspiracy to commit inheritance fraud. You have the right to remain silent." As Grace was led away in handcuffs, she made one final attempt at manipulation. "This isn't over, Walid. You think you can just erase 3 years? You think Amir will ever trust you again after you failed to protect him from me?" But her words no longer carried power. Amir walked to his father, no longer hiding his ability, no longer afraid to show his truth. "Papa," he said quietly, "I never stopped trusting you. I just stopped trusting myself." Dr. Harrison pulled Walid aside as the police completed their initial investigation. "The psychological evaluation will be crucial," he said. "Amir has been subjected to systematic abuse disguised as medical care. He'll need specialized therapy to process the betrayal and manipulation he's experienced." Walid nodded, understanding that while Grace's immediate threat was over, the healing process was just beginning. But for the first time in 3 years, he felt hope. Layla stood by the window, watching the police cars depart. Tom Rodriguez approached her with a gentle expression. "Little girl, where are you staying tonight?" he asked. "Subway tunnel," she replied matter-of-factly. "Is warm enough when train's running." Walid overheard and felt his heart break. This brave child who had saved his son was returning to homelessness while he lived in luxury. "Layla," he said, kneeling to her level, "how would you feel about staying here tonight? We have plenty of room. And I think Amir would like to get to know the girl who helped free him." For the first time since her parents' death, Layla smiled with genuine joy. "You sure? I very small. I not eat much. I'm very sure," Walid said. "And I think it's time we all learned about taking care of each other the right way." As evening fell over Manhattan, 3 unlikely allies, a billionaire, his son, and a refugee child, began the process of healing from betrayal and building something that Grace had tried to destroy, a family based on truth, trust, and genuine love. The days following Grace's arrest brought a whirlwind of media attention that Walid struggled to navigate while protecting Amir's privacy. News of the pharmaceutical billionaire's son walking for the first time in 3 years after exposing his stepmother's deception spread across social media like wildfire. But Walid was determined to shield both Amir and Layla from the circus that inevitably surrounded stories involving wealth, betrayal, and miraculous recoveries. Dr. Sarah Chen, a specialist in trauma psychology, arrived at the penthouse 3 days after Grace's arrest. She had worked extensively with children who had been victims of medical abuse, a disturbing but increasingly documented form of child maltreatment. Her gentle demeanor and genuine warmth immediately put both children at ease. "Amir," Dr. Chen said during their first session, "I want you to understand that nothing that happened to you was your fault. Adults are supposed to protect children, not use them for their own purposes." Amir sat cross-legged on his bed, something he hadn't been allowed to do in 3 years, while Layla played quietly with building blocks in the corner. Walid had discovered that the children felt more comfortable when they weren't separated, having formed a protective bond over their shared experiences of adult betrayal. "But I should have been stronger," Amir said, echoing Grace's conditioning. "I should have found a way to tell Papa the truth sooner." Dr. Chen shook her head firmly. "Amir, Grace was a trained medical professional who used sophisticated psychological manipulation techniques. She drugged you when you tried to resist, isolated you from potential allies, and convinced you that speaking the truth would hurt the people you loved. What she did to you is recognized by law enforcement as a form of torture." The word torture hit Walid like a physical blow. He had been sitting quietly in the corner, listening to his son describe 3 years of systematic psychological and chemical abuse. Every revelation made him question how he could have missed the signs, how someone he trusted could have hidden such cruelty behind a facade of care. Layla looked up from her blocks. "In my country, bad soldiers use same tricks. They make people think if they tell truth, family will get hurt. Is very old trick, very mean." Her matter-of-fact acknowledgement of sophisticated psychological warfare techniques reminded everyone that, despite her age, Layla carried wisdom born from surviving genuine evil. Dr. Chen made note to recommend that Layla also receive counseling for her own traumas. Detective Santos visited regularly to update them on the investigation's progress. The evidence against Grace was overwhelming. Medical records had been falsified. Insurance companies had been defrauded of hundreds of thousands of dollars. And toxicology reports confirmed that Amir had been systematically drugged with powerful sedatives and muscle relaxants. We've also discovered that Grace had been researching methods to induce actual paralysis, Detective Santos revealed during one particularly difficult meeting. Her computer searches included queries about spinal cord damage and untraceable neurotoxins. I believe she was planning to make Amir's condition permanent before he could expose her. The revelation sent chills through everyone present. Grace hadn't just been content with maintaining a lie. She had been prepared to cause permanent damage to ensure her deception could never be revealed. Walid's pharmaceutical company became instrumental in the investigation. His team of medical researchers analyzed the substances found in Grace's possession, discovering a cocktail of drugs that would have gradually caused real neurological damage if administered long-term. Grace's medical knowledge had made her particularly dangerous. She understood exactly how to abuse a child while appearing to care for him. "Papa," Amir said one evening as they sat together watching the sunset over Central Park, "do you think I'll ever feel normal again?" Walid considered the question carefully. Normal seemed like an inadequate goal for a boy who had survived 3 years of systematic abuse and emerged with his spirit intact. "I think you'll feel better than normal," he said finally. "I think you'll feel true." Layla, who had been quietly drawing pictures of her parents, looked up with interest. "What is the difference between normal and true?" "Normal is what other people expect you to be," Walid explained. "True is who you actually are, without anyone else's lies covering it up." The conversation sparked something important in both children. They began talking about their experiences with unprecedented openness, helping each other process trauma through shared understanding. Meanwhile, the legal proceedings against Grace moved forward with unprecedented speed. The district attorney's office had assigned their most experienced prosecutor to the case, recognizing its potential to set important precedents for medical fraud and child abuse cases. Grace's defense team attempted to argue that she had genuinely believed she was helping Amir, but the evidence of premeditation was overwhelming. The most damning discovery came when investigators found Grace's private journal hidden in a safe deposit box registered under an assumed name. The entries detailed her growing realization that Amir was recovering naturally, her decision to maintain the deception for financial gain, and her escalating plans to ensure the boy could never expose her. Subject showing increased leg movement and sensation. One entry read, "Must increase sedation protocols and consider more permanent solutions. Inheritance timeline accelerated. Adoption must be completed within 6 months." The clinical, calculating tone of the entries revealed Grace's true nature. She hadn't been a caring stepmother who had made mistakes. She had been a predator who had identified a vulnerable family and systematically exploited their trust. Dr. Harrison provided crucial testimony about the medical fraud aspects of the case. "In 30 years of practice, I have never seen such elaborate and sustained medical deception," he told the grand jury. Grace Thompson demonstrated sophisticated knowledge of how to manipulate test results, forge symptoms, and use legitimate medical procedures as weapons of abuse. The wider implications of the case began attracting attention from medical ethics boards and child protection agencies nationwide. Grace's ability to maintain her deception for 3 years while working within the medical system raised serious questions about oversight and accountability in cases involving vulnerable patients. Walid found himself reluctantly becoming a spokesperson for better protection of children in medical settings. His pharmaceutical company announced a new initiative to develop protocols for detecting medical abuse, funding research that would help identify patterns of suspicious treatment and medication patterns. Grace succeeded because she understood that people trust medical authority, Walid explained in a carefully managed press conference. "She used our respect for healthcare professionals as a weapon against my family. We need to ensure this can never happen again." Layla's role in exposing the abuse made her a minor celebrity, though Walid was careful to protect her identity and privacy. The 5-year-old refugee who had saved a billionaire's son became a symbol of how truth could emerge from the most unexpected sources. Child advocacy groups began reaching out, wanting to use Layla's story to highlight the wisdom and resilience of refugee children, but Walid was adamant that her privacy be protected, understanding that she needed stability and security more than public recognition. "She's been through enough exploitation," he told the advocates. "What she needs now is to be a child, not a symbol." The healing process for both Amir and Layla was gradual but steady. Physical therapy helped Amir regain full strength and coordination after months of forced inactivity. More importantly, psychological therapy helped him understand that his survival of Grace's abuse demonstrated strength, not weakness. Layla's integration into the family happened naturally. Her refugee experiences had taught her to adapt quickly to new situations, but for the first time since her parents' death, she felt genuinely safe. Walid began legal proceedings to become her guardian, understanding that the brave little girl who had saved his son needed protection and love as much as she had needed justice. The Manhattan District Attorney's Office announced that Grace would face charges including aggravated child abuse, medical fraud, conspiracy to commit inheritance fraud, and attempted poisoning. If convicted on all counts, she faced a potential sentence of 25 years to life in prison. As winter approached, the Al-Nasir household began to feel like a real home for the first time in years. Amir's laughter echoed through rooms that had been silent during Grace's reign of control. Layla's presence brought a perspective that helped them all appreciate simple freedoms they had taken for granted. Dr. Chen noted remarkable progress in both children during her weekly sessions. "They're healing each other," she observed to Walid. "Amir is learning that survival doesn't require submission, while Layla is learning that adults can be trusted to protect rather than exploit." The transformation was evident in small moments. Amir running freely through the penthouse, Layla sleeping peacefully without nightmares, both children playing games and laughing with the unconscious joy of young people who no longer had to guard every word or action. But the most significant change was in Walid himself. 3 years of believing his son was disabled had taught him to focus on limitations rather than possibilities. Now, watching both children thrive, he began to understand that the greatest gift he could give them wasn't protection from all hardship, but the confidence to face challenges with truth and courage. "Papa," Amir said one evening as they prepared for bed, "I'm glad Grace got caught, but I'm more glad that Layla was brave enough to tell you the truth." Layla, who was brushing her teeth in the adjoining bathroom, poked her head out with a mouthful of toothpaste foam. "I'm not brave," she said after spitting. "I just tired of seeing sad boy in cage." Her simple honesty captured something essential about heroism. It often came not from extraordinary courage, but from ordinary people refusing to accept unnecessary suffering when they had the power to speak truth. 3 months after Grace's arrest, the trial began with unprecedented media coverage. The case had captured public imagination, not just because of the dramatic revelation, but because it challenged fundamental assumptions about trust, family, and the vulnerability of children in medical settings. Walid had hired the best legal team available, not just to ensure Grace's conviction, but to protect Amir and Layla from the trauma of extensive court testimony. The prosecution's case was methodical and devastating. Medical records were presented, showing the systematic falsification of test results. Video surveillance from the hospital revealed Grace disposing of medications that should have been administered to Amir, and expert witnesses testified about the long-term psychological damage caused by her manipulation techniques. Dr. Rachel Martinez, a forensic psychiatrist, provided particularly damning testimony about the sophistication of Grace's psychological abuse. The defendant demonstrated expert-level knowledge of trauma bonding, gaslighting, and medical authority manipulation, she explained to the jury. She systematically destroyed this child's ability to trust his own perceptions while positioning herself as his only protector. This represents some of the most calculating psychological abuse I have encountered in 20 years of practice. Grace's defense team attempted to argue that she had genuinely believed she was protecting Amir from potential medical complications, but the evidence of her research into permanent paralysis techniques destroyed any credibility this argument might have had. Her own journal entries, read aloud in court, revealed a mind focused entirely on financial gain rather than child welfare. Amir was required to provide testimony, but Judge Catherine Williams ensured it was conducted in her chambers with minimal personnel present. Dr. Chen was allowed to accompany him, and the session was recorded rather than conducted in open court. "Can you tell us about the last time Grace gave you medicine?" the prosecutor asked gently. Amir, now 11 and visibly stronger both physically and emotionally, answered clearly. "The morning before Papa came home with Layla, Grace said I needed extra vitamins because my legs were having phantom pain episodes. She gave me a shot in my arm that made me feel dizzy and sleepy." "Had you been experiencing leg pain that morning?" "No, sir. I never had leg pain. But when I told Grace that, she said the medicine would help me think more clearly about my symptoms." The twisted logic of Grace's manipulation was evident even in these simple exchanges. She had used medical terminology to gaslight a child into doubting his own physical experiences. Layla's testimony was even more carefully protected. At 5 years old, she was considered too young for traditional court testimony. But her initial statements to police were admitted as evidence. Detective Santos read Layla's words to the jury. "The boy very sad because he have to pretend he cannot walk. The pretty lady make him think his papa will die if he tell truth. In my country, I see bad people use love to make children scared to speak." The simple clarity of her observations cut through legal complexity to reveal the emotional truth of Grace's crimes. Expert witnesses provided context that helped the jury understand the broader implications of the case. Dr. Amanda Foster, who researched medical abuse at Johns Hopkins, testified that Grace's methods represented a particularly sophisticated form of Munchausen syndrome by proxy, a condition where caregivers deliberately cause or fabricate illness in those they care for, usually to gain attention or sympathy. "What makes this case particularly disturbing," Dr. Foster explained, "is the defendant's use of a real accident and genuine initial trauma to construct an elaborate ongoing deception. She didn't need to cause the original injury, she simply prevented natural healing from occurring." The financial evidence was equally compelling. Forensic accountants detailed how Grace had positioned herself to inherit not just Amir's trust fund, but control of significant portions of Waleed's pharmaceutical empire through her planned adoption and marriage. Insurance fraud investigators revealed that over $800,000 had been fraudulently claimed for treatments Amir never needed. As the trial progressed, Grace's demeanor shifted from defiant to desperate. Her carefully maintained appearance began to deteriorate as the weight of evidence mounted against her. The caring nurse persona that had fooled everyone for years completely disappeared, replaced by someone who seemed genuinely shocked that her deception had been discovered. During cross-examination, Grace made several damaging admissions. When pressed about her research into paralysis-inducing substances, she claimed it was for educational purposes, to better understand Amir's condition. But when confronted with search terms like untraceable neurotoxins and permanent spinal cord damage, her explanations became increasingly incoherent. The prosecution's closing argument focused on the systematic nature of Grace's abuse and its broader implications for child protection. "This case is about more than one woman's greed," the prosecutor told the jury. "It's about how easily a predator can use our trust in medical authority to abuse the most vulnerable members of our society. Grace Thompson didn't just steal money. She stole 3 years of a child's life and nearly destroyed his ability to trust the adults responsible for protecting him." Grace's defense made a final, desperate attempt to portray her as a well-meaning caregiver who had made mistakes rather than deliberate crimes. But the evidence was overwhelming, and their arguments seemed hollow in the face of documented systematic abuse. Outside the courthouse, supporters had gathered carrying signs reading, "Justice for Amir and Protect Our Children." The case had sparked a broader conversation about medical oversight and the need for better protections against healthcare-related abuse. Waleed had used his platform as a prominent businessman to advocate for legislative changes that would make Grace's type of deception more difficult to sustain. His pharmaceutical company had developed new protocols for detecting suspicious patterns in pediatric treatment, and he had endowed a research fund focused on preventing medical abuse. Grace succeeded because she exploited our faith in medical professionals and our love for our children, Waleed said in a carefully prepared statement. "We must ensure that such exploitation becomes impossible, not just unlikely." The verdict came after 2 days of jury deliberation, Grace Thompson was found guilty on all charges: aggravated child abuse, medical fraud, conspiracy to commit inheritance fraud, attempted poisoning, and insurance fraud. Judge Williams sentenced her to 28 years in prison without possibility of parole for 12 years. Mr. Thompson, Judge Williams said during sentencing, you held a position of trust that gave you unprecedented access to vulnerable individuals. You used that trust as a weapon against a child who depended on you for care and protection. Your crimes represent a betrayal not just of the Al-Nasir family, but of every parent who trusts medical professionals with their children's lives. Grace showed no remorse during sentencing, instead glaring at Walid with undisguised hatred. Her final words to the court were, "I gave that boy more attention and care than his father ever did. I was the only one who truly understood his needs." The statement revealed that even after conviction, Grace continued to believe her own twisted narrative. Dr. Chen later explained that this wasn't unusual among perpetrators of sophisticated psychological abuse. They often became convinced by their own deceptions. The civil lawsuits that followed the criminal trial resulted in additional consequences for Grace: medical malpractice claims, emotional damage suits, and fraud recovery cases would ensure that any assets she had hidden would be seized for victim compensation. More importantly, the case led to significant changes in medical oversight protocols. Hospitals nationwide implemented new systems for tracking unusual treatment patterns, and medical boards strengthened requirements for second opinions in cases involving long-term pediatric care. Amir and Layla watched the news coverage of the sentencing from the safety of their home, both children relieved to finally see official acknowledgement that Grace's actions had been wrong. For months, despite all evidence and support, both had struggled with lingering doubts about whether they had somehow caused the abuse. "It's really over now," Amir said quietly as they watched Grace being led away in handcuffs. Layla nodded solemnly. "Bad people always think they're smarter than everyone else, but truth is like sunrise. You cannot hide it forever." Dr. Chen, who had continued working with both children throughout the trial, noted remarkable progress in their healing. They've learned that speaking truth, even when it's difficult, is both powerful and necessary, she observed. That lesson will serve them well throughout their lives. The media attention gradually faded, allowing the family to focus on building a future based on honesty and trust rather than deception and control. Both children had learned that adults could fail them, but they had also learned that other adults could be trusted to listen, believe, and protect them when necessary. Walid reflected often on how close he had come to losing his son, not to medical paralysis, but to something far worse, a complete loss of truth and trust within his own family. Grace's defeat had been total, but the victory belonged to two children who had refused to accept that lies were stronger than reality. 6 months after Grace's conviction, life had settled into a rhythm that felt both new and natural for the Al-Nasir household. Amir's physical recovery had been complete within weeks. His young body had quickly regained full strength and coordination once freed from chemical restraints. His psychological healing took longer, but with Dr. Chen's guidance and Layla's friendship, he was learning to trust his own perceptions and voice his needs without fear. Layla's legal status had been resolved through Walid's adoption proceedings. The little girl who had arrived as a homeless refugee now carried the name Layla Al-Nasser and held both American citizenship and the security of belonging to a family that valued her courage and honesty. Her own trauma counseling had helped her process the losses of war and displacement, while building new attachments based on safety rather than survival necessity. The transformation in their home was evident to everyone who visited. Tom Rodriguez, now head of security for Al-Nasir Pharmaceuticals, often commented on the change in atmosphere. "It's like the whole place was holding its breath for 3 years, he told his wife. "Now it feels like a real home where kids can be kids." Dr. Chen had gradually reduced her visits from weekly to monthly, as both children demonstrated remarkable resilience. During their final formal session, she reflected on what had made their recovery so successful. "You saved each other," she told Amir and Layla. "Amir, Layla showed you that speaking truth could be safe when the right adults were listening." Layla, "Amir showed you that some families really do protect their children. You each gave the other proof that trust could be rebuilt." The children's friendship had evolved beyond shared trauma into genuine companionship. Despite their 5-year age difference and vastly different backgrounds, they had formed a sibling bond that surprised everyone with its depth and maturity. Amir had become fiercely protective of his little sister, while Layla's practical wisdom often grounded Amir when anxiety threatened to overwhelm him. Their different perspectives enriched their shared experiences. When Amir struggled with nightmares about Grace returning, Layla would remind him that bad people in jail couldn't hurt children anymore. When Layla missed her birth parents with overwhelming sadness, Amir helped her understand that loving new family didn't mean forgetting old family. Waleed had made significant changes to his business practices as well. The Grace Thompson case had taught him that his focus on professional success had blinded him to dangers much closer to home. He now spent mornings with the children before going to work and returned home for family dinners every evening. A schedule that initially seemed impossible but had improved both his family relationships and his business effectiveness. His pharmaceutical company had become a leader in developing protocols for detecting medical abuse. The Amir Initiative funded research into sophisticated abuse detection systems and trained medical professionals to recognize signs of deliberate harm disguised as necessary treatment. Grace was able to abuse my son because our medical system trusts professionals to self-regulate, Waleed explained to a congressional committee examining healthcare oversight. We need external verification systems that can identify suspicious patterns before children suffer permanent damage. The legislative changes that resulted from his advocacy would prevent future cases like Amir's. New requirements for independent medical evaluations in long-term pediatric cases, mandatory second opinions for unusual treatment patterns, and enhanced oversight of controlled substance prescriptions created multiple barriers to the type of systematic abuse Grace had perpetrated. International attention had also focused on Layla's role in the case. Refugee advocacy organizations highlighted how displaced children often possessed survival skills that included detecting deception and manipulation. Several countries implemented new programs training social workers to listen more carefully to refugee children's observations about their care situations. Refugee children have often survived situations where adults in authority positions were dangerous, explained Dr. Amira Hassan, who directed refugee services for the United Nations. Their wariness of adult deception isn't paranoia, it's hard-earned wisdom that can protect other vulnerable children when we pay attention to their insights. The children's story had also inspired changes in how medical institutions approached patient advocacy. Several hospitals implemented child observer programs where specially trained staff members periodically checked on long-term pediatric patients without the primary caregiver present, creating opportunities for children to report concerns privately. As the 1-year anniversary of Grace's arrest approached, both children had grown remarkably. Amir had gained 4 inches in height, growth that Dr. Harrison attributed partly to improved nutrition and exercise, but also to the stress reduction that came with freedom from psychological abuse. His confidence had blossomed as he rediscovered interests and abilities that Grace had systematically discouraged. Layla had flourished in ways that amazed everyone familiar with her background. Her English had become fluent, her nightmares had largely ceased, and she had begun showing artistic talents that Waleed encouraged through private lessons. Most importantly, she had learned to be a child, playing games, making messes, and expressing opinions without constantly watching for adult reactions. Their school had been carefully chosen for its experience with children who had faced unusual challenges. Both were thriving academically, but more importantly, they were learning to interact with peers who knew nothing of their dramatic past. Other children simply saw Amir as the boy who was really good at math, and Layla as the girl who told the most interesting stories during circle time. Dr. Harrison continued monitoring Amir's health with regular checkups, not because any problems were expected, but because complete medical documentation was important for preventing future deception. Each examination confirmed what had been obvious from the beginning. Amir had never suffered any spinal cord damage and showed no lasting effects from Grace's chemical restraints. It's remarkable how resilient children's bodies are, Dr. Harrison observed. 3 years of unnecessary medication and forced inactivity, yet his system recovered completely within months. Children are far stronger than we often give them credit for. The psychological resilience had been even more impressive. Both children had faced sophisticated manipulation and betrayal by trusted adults, yet both had emerged with their capacity for trust intact. Dr. Chen attributed this partly to their youth, but mostly to the immediate safety and validation they had received once the truth was revealed. Recovery from psychological trauma requires three things, she explained to other professionals studying their case: safety, truth-telling, and supportive relationships. These children received all three immediately after disclosure, which prevented the additional trauma that often comes from not being believed or protected. The family had established traditions that honored both children's histories while building new shared memories. They celebrated both American holidays and cultural traditions from Layla's homeland. They visited refugee support organizations where Layla could speak Arabic with other displaced children, and they attended conferences where Amir could meet other children who had survived medical abuse. Most importantly, they had established a family rule that feelings and observations should always be shared, no matter how uncomfortable. Weekly family meetings provided structured time for each person to voice concerns, share achievements, and discuss any worries about their relationships with each other. Grace succeeded because she made Amir afraid to trust his own perceptions, Walid reflected. Our family will never again allow anyone to feel they must hide their truth to keep others happy. As winter approached, marking a full year since Grace's deception had been exposed, the family planned a celebration that honored their survival and growth. It would be a private gathering focused on gratitude rather than publicity, acknowledging how far they had traveled from those dark days when lies had poisoned their home. The celebration would also mark the completion of legal proceedings related to Grace's crimes. All appeals had been exhausted, all civil suits had been settled, and all policy changes had been implemented. The chapter of their lives defined by her manipulation was officially closed. Looking toward the future, each family member had grown in ways that Grace's control would never have permitted. Walid had become a more present father and a more effective advocate for vulnerable children. Amir had regained not just his physical freedom, but his confidence in speaking truth even when it was difficult. Layla had found safety and belonging while retaining the strength and wisdom that had enabled her to survive war and displacement. Their story had become one of transformation rather than just survival, proof that truth, no matter how small the voice that speaks it, really could overcome elaborate deceptions. A 5-year-old refugee and a 10-year-old boy had taught the world that children's voices deserved to be heard, believed, and protected. 2 years had passed since Grace's conviction, and life had found its rhythm in the Al-Nasir household. Amir, now 13, had grown tall and confident, excelling in school and passionate about mathematics. Layla, 7 years old, spoke 3 languages fluently and had begun showing remarkable artistic talents. Both children had not only recovered from their traumas, but had transformed their painful experiences into strength and wisdom that inspired everyone around them. But their greatest test was yet to come. On a crisp autumn morning, Detective Santos called with news that sent chills through Walid's spine. Grace Thompson had been granted a medical parole due to a sudden onset of what prison doctors claimed was early-stage Alzheimer's disease. Her legal team had successfully argued that she posed no threat to society in her deteriorated mental state. The prison psychiatrist says she doesn't even remember the crimes, Detective Santos explained, her voice tight with frustration. Her lawyers convinced the parole board that keeping her incarcerated would be inhumane given her condition. Walid felt the old fear creeping back, not for himself, but for his children who had worked so hard to build lives free from Grace's shadow. Amir and Layla deserved to live without looking over their shoulders, wondering if the woman who had tormented them might return. Within hours of Grace's release, disturbing events began unfolding. A package arrived at the penthouse containing childhood photos of both Amir and Layla, with handwritten notes in Grace's distinctive script. "Missing my precious children. A mother never forgets her babies." Tom Rodriguez immediately increased security protocols, but the psychological message was clear. Grace's supposed memory loss was selective at best. She remembered exactly who had destroyed her carefully constructed plans. Dr. Chen was called in for emergency sessions with both children. The news of Grace's release had triggered anxiety responses they thought were behind them. Amir began experiencing nightmares again, while Layla reverted to some of the hyper-vigilant behaviors she had shown as a traumatized refugee. "She can't hurt you. Walid assured them during a family meeting. Security is tighter now, and everyone knows what she's capable of. The whole world is watching. But Grace had always been smarter than anyone anticipated. Within a week, she had somehow obtained employment at a pediatric clinic in New Jersey, using forged credentials and a false identity. Her supposed Alzheimer's symptoms had mysteriously improved enough for her to pass basic competency tests. The discovery came when Tom Rodriguez's security team traced suspicious activity around Amir's school. Grace had been photographing children during recess, clearly targeting families with vulnerable circumstances. She hadn't forgotten anything. She had simply found a new hunting ground. "This ends now," Walid declared when the evidence was presented to him. But it was Layla who provided the solution with the same clarity that had originally exposed Grace's deception. "She thinks we still scared of her," Layla said during dinner one evening. "She thinks if she make us afraid, we forget how to be strong, but she wrong. We not same children she hurt before." Amir nodded, understanding immediately. "We're not going to hide anymore, are we?" The decision was made as a family. Instead of retreating into protected isolation, they would face Grace directly, not as victims, but as survivors who had grown beyond her ability to control them. Working with Detective Santos and the FBI, they arranged a controlled confrontation. Grace's parole conditions required her to meet with her former victims as part of a supposed rehabilitation program. What she didn't know was that every word would be recorded, and that the children she expected to find cowering with fear had become something she had never anticipated. Young people who knew their own worth and refused to be silenced. The meeting took place in a secure conference room with law enforcement officials present. Grace entered expecting to see broken children she could manipulate one final time. Instead, she found Amir and Layla sitting straight and calm, their eyes clear and unafraid. "Hello, Grace," Amir said simply. "We wanted you to know that we're not afraid of you anymore." Layla added, "And we want to make sure you never hurt other children the way you tried to hurt us." For the first time in years, Grace Thompson found herself face-to-face with victims who had grown beyond her ability to harm them. Her elaborate manipulation techniques were useless against children who had learned to trust their own voices and the adults who protected them. The confrontation lasted less than an hour, but it accomplished something crucial. It proved that truth and healing were stronger than deception and control. Grace's final attempt at manipulation ended in complete failure. Her supposed memory loss disappeared entirely when confronted by Amir and Layla's courage, revealing her parole had been granted based on fabricated medical evidence. Within weeks, she was back in prison facing additional charges for parole violation, identity fraud, and attempting to gain access to vulnerable children. The FBI investigation revealed that Grace had never intended to live quietly after her release. She had been systematically planning to target other wealthy families with disabled children, using the same techniques that had nearly destroyed the Al-Nasirs. Her rehabilitation had actually been preparation for more sophisticated crimes, but her greatest miscalculation was underestimating how much her original victims had grown. Amir and Layla's willingness to face their abuser directly had provided law enforcement with the evidence needed to ensure Grace would never again have access to vulnerable children. Their courage had protected countless other families from experiencing the trauma they had endured. Dr. Chen documented their final confrontation with Grace as a remarkable example of trauma recovery. Most abuse victims spend years learning that they are not responsible for their abuser's actions, she explained. Amir and Layla went further. They learned that they had the power to prevent future abuse by speaking truth fearlessly. The children's transformation was complete. Amir had grown into a thoughtful teenager, passionate about medical ethics and child protection advocacy. Layla had blossomed into a confident young girl whose artistic talents were matched by her ability to spot deception and speak truth to power. Walid's pharmaceutical company had become a leader not just in developing life-saving medications, but in creating systems that protected vulnerable patients from abuse. The protocols developed after Grace's exposure had been implemented internationally, preventing hundreds of cases of medical fraud and abuse. Most importantly, their family had learned that love built on truth was unbreakable. They had faced the worst kind of betrayal, deception from someone they trusted with their most precious relationships, and emerged not just intact, but stronger. Their story became proof that even the most sophisticated evil could be defeated by the simple courage to speak truth, the wisdom to listen to unexpected voices, and the commitment to protect those who could not protect themselves. The Al-Nasir family had not just survived Grace Thompson's manipulation, they had transformed their pain into purpose, ensuring that their suffering would prevent others from facing similar betrayal. What started as a homeless refugee child's simple observation about a boy who could walk became a story that changed child protection laws, exposed sophisticated medical fraud, and proved that truth spoken by the most vulnerable voices could defeat the most elaborate deceptions. This incredible true story of survival, courage, and justice reminds us that heroes come in unexpected forms, sometimes as small as a 5-year-old girl who refused to ignore what she witnessed. Amir and Layla's journey from victims to advocates shows us that even the darkest betrayals can be overcome when families choose truth over comfort and courage over silence. Their story continues to inspire changes in medical oversight, refugee advocacy, and child protection worldwide. Every time a medical professional reports suspicious treatment patterns, every time a refugee child's observations are taken seriously, every time truth defeats deception, their courage creates ripples of protection for other vulnerable children. If this story moved you, remember that there are children like Layla in your own community, refugee children whose wisdom and observations could protect others if we just take the time to listen. There are families like the Al-Nasirs who need support to overcome betrayal and rebuild trust, and there are systems that need advocates to ensure that what happened to Amir can never happen to another child. Sometimes, the greatest act of heroism is simply believing a child who tells us something that seems impossible, listening to voices that society often ignores, and choosing to act when we witness injustice, no matter how small our action might seem. The truth really can set us free, but only if we have the courage to speak it, and the wisdom to hear it when it comes from unexpected places.